Welcome to Meet the Thriller Author, the podcast where I interview best-selling authors from the world of thriller and mystery. I'm your host, Alan Petersen, and this is episode number 207. Before we dive into today's interview, a quick reminder to check out my latest psychological thriller, The Basement, now a bestseller in the domestic thriller category on Amazon. If you're a fan of suspenseful, mind-twisting reads, head over to thrillingreads.com/basement to grab your copy. Also, don't forget to visit thrillerauthors.com for show notes, archives, and transcripts of all my interviews with best-selling authors. Today, I'm joined by USA Today best-selling author Jenny Milchman. Jenny's latest book, The Usual Silence, is already climbing the charts as part of Amazon's First Reads program. We'll be talking about the inspiration behind this suspenseful new release, her writing process, and much more. Stay tuned. It's going to be a great episode with Jenny Milchman coming right up. Hi, Jenny. Thanks for coming onto the podcast. Really excited to have you on.
I appreciate that. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and the Usual Silence comes out October 1st. It's already in the top of the charts. It's available now through Amazon First Read. So if depending on when you're listening to this, you can already go get it if you're on Amazon Prime program. But it's awesome. I've started reading it. I haven't finished it yet, but I've been enjoying it a lot. And just wanted to ask you about the whole concept because it's pretty there's suspense, of course. It's a thriller, but the whole background of psychotherapy and with children, and I know that's your background before you started writing. So can you tell us a little bit about how all that came into play, and if this book is influenced from your background, your professional background?
Yeah, I mean, I think that goes to the crux of the novel. It really does, because I was a psychotherapist. That was going to be my career. It came about because my parents sort of asked me mid-college, how are you going to make a living? And being a writer, especially I was going to be a poet, it doesn't always pay the bills. So I went to graduate school. I studied psychology. I was working as a psychotherapist at a rural community mental health center. And I was given this I was assigned this very scary case, 5-year-old child, and she had done something just very violent. Without going into too many details, it was almost as if my life was a suspense novel. And it hit me that if you want to be a writer, what do you read? What do you love curling up with at night? So I sat down, began writing my first suspense novel. This is a long time ago. It never got published. But I kind of, I couldn't avoid the siren song of writing anymore. And 20 years went by before this character of Arles Shepard, who is a psychologist herself, came to me. And I met with the publisher over at Thomas and Mercer, and they sort of had this creative spark that they gave me. And lo and behold, 20 years passed and The Usual Silence is coming out, and you were very kind to read it. I appreciate that.
So even before you chose to become a psychotherapist, you were interested in writing, and you're a fan of the suspense and thriller type novels from before that?
See, writing was the dream for sure. It was always the dream, for so many of us, right? We're little kids and we're making up stories. And I think what clicked for me is that in wanting to be a poet, that's very highfalutin. And I went to college and I took English literature and this and that. But the novels that I was weaned on, it was the horror and the suspense of the 70s. I can still remember sitting in the library stacks and one Stephen King after another. I had to read them there because my parents would have been worried if I was reading stuff that advanced when I was so young. So I don't even remember what got me started on this. But yes, that was always the dream. And the suspense, the thriller, the horror, I mean, that's the good stuff. That's the stuff that keeps us up at night. Me, anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. No, same here. I think we all started out with the same books. Wow, I didn't even know you could write fiction like this.
Yeah, exactly.
So I'm also very curious, especially since I have a podcast, and true crime podcasts play a role in this with the characters. And I know that what is it? Up and Vanished and Serial, of course, so popular, and they've actually solved cold cases.
Yeah.
So can you tell us a little bit about that, how that plays into your sleuths here with The Usual Silence? And are you a fan of true crime podcasts?
So it's a big part of the book. You're absolutely right. And what I was interested in is So there's a storyline where Cass is married to Maggie and their daughter goes missing. And one thing I should put out there for all your listeners is that you could easily say no children or animals harmed in a Jenny Milchman novel. So you're not going to believe it. If you read the novel, you won't believe me, but their daughter does go missing, but I will not put you through anything that I could not deal with. So Cass, who's really desperate, the police have not come up with anything, turns to a pair of true crime podcasters. And I love these characters. I just think they're so like of the moment and so smart and so wise. And I think we're really in a place right now where like boots on the ground, like the quote lay person is doing incredible things out there. I mean, we have lay people who are reviewing books, we have lay people who are solving crimes, as you say, sometimes cases that have gone terribly cold. So this particular podcast, In the Usual Silence, it's fictionalized, but I believe it down to my soul. I think these two women could easily have helped with the crime as they did.
Yeah, and that's something that you touched upon too. Like, these are very in real life, very tough subjects
Yeah.
to deal with. So
Yeah.
what's the balance there? Because you obviously you want to entertain us, a good suspense novel, but you're also telling us about some pretty awful stuff that happens in real life. So
Yeah.
how do you balance that to make sure that we're entertained but not like freaking us out too
Yeah.
much?
Yeah, it's such a tough balance. And I have a content warning in the acknowledgments or in the afterword, because there's trauma and abuse in my character's background. At the same time, I feel like it's real life on the page. I mean, a lot of us are struggling with, I believe there's a spectrum of trauma and abuse, and it's rare that I meet anybody who hasn't had at least some experiences where when they read about that in a novel, they feel as if there's that empathic connection and they know that they're not alone. And even if we know that we're not alone, like it can feel as if what I just said about that spectrum and how many people have touched at some point on it isn't true. And that, trauma can be very isolating. So that's one reason why it's in my books. But the other thing is that a lot of writers braver than I deal with these same subjects, and there's maybe not so much the like the point of triumph that I am writing to. And so one promise I make to my readers, and not everybody wants this, some people really want to see it more, well, it doesn't always end well or whatever, but one promise I make to my readers is that there's a reason why these characters are going through it, and they are going to vanquish their demons in one way or another. So that's a long answer to a really hard question, but it's the best one I've got right now.
Yeah, it must be kind of nice. I don't know if that's the right word, but for you, like, because you've seen some in your career as a psychotherapist, you've seen some terrible stuff. So at least you
Yeah.
can like, it's fiction, so you can have a little better, perhaps things turn out a little better than they do in real life. So
Right.
it could kind of be kind of nice for you to, s- from what you deal with in real life.
Yeah, I mean, what happens if justice is actually found? And what happens if, Arles, in many ways, Arles can do the things that I was not able to do.
Mhm.
And you're right, it's super satisfying to give her that power.
Yeah, and I've noticed that this is a series, right? So there'll be more
Yeah.
books. Oh, that's cool. All right. So you're already working on the next one, I assume.
Yeah, I actually just turned it in. And this is the first series. I've had five other novels published, and they're all set in the same fictional town, which is a wilderness, remote town in the Adirondacks. But this was the first one where my publisher really was like, wait a minute, what if there's a character who could come back and come back and come back? And so I just turned the second in the series in, and it's exciting. It's exciting to see what Arles went through in The Usual Silence influences the second book, and yet she's back to save another child.
Oh, so your other books were standalones before
They
this?
were.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. So you enjoying going back? Like you don't have to create everything from scratch.
I love it more than I ever imagined I would. It's not even so much I mean, you're right. And that's, of course, a feature of series, but it's not even that. It's more that I can see her life unfold. And, she's a 37-year-old woman who has never had a love interest in her life. In The Usual Silence, there's the first glimmers of one. And then in the next book, I could be like, well, what would happen with that? And what did happen with that? I almost feel like I'm looking at a portal and watching her life unfold. And it's very thrilling.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I was gonna ask about that too, because that the character is the neurodivergent
Mhm.
autistic individual. Can you tell us a little bit about that? What made you choose to display that? And
Yeah,
and there's a lot of talk now about representation in fiction.
right.
Is that something that was important to you to include a character that's neurodivergent?
I felt like it was an honor and a privilege to get to try to do it. I was very aware all through the writing. And so you're talking about Gary. He's a 10-year-old boy who's autistic. Um, I was very aware in the story that this was not it's not my story to tell. So he is not a point of view character. I hope that I did right by him in putting really who he is on the page and letting him do his Geary thing. And I love this kid. I think he's just amazing. He communicates and perceives in ways that not everybody does, but he is so smart and intuitive. But in terms of what you said about representation, I tried very hard to toe the line of knowing that, I am neurotypical myself, and that's the framework I can speak from. And also just nuts and bolts. We had a culture read because I was so aware that there are ways I was not going to get this right. And I was very grateful to my culture reader who showed me where I misstepped and how I could do better.
Oh wow. Okay, so you have somebody. Oh, okay, so someone who's experienced with that and kind
Right.
of. Oh, okay,
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
interesting. Yeah, yeah. And so I also kind of wondering too now. More on your writing journey because I saw this on your website or I can't remember where I saw this, but you talked about your journey.
Yeah.
A lot of rejection, of course, as writers, we have to have thick skins.
Mhm.
Can you tell us a little bit about that, about your journey? I know you mentioned that it was 20 years in the making, but can you tell us a little bit more about that and how to handle rejections? Because I do have a lot of aspiring writers that listen to this podcast.
Yeah, I bet. I tell you a little bit, I can tell you a lot about it. I had so I had I had seven novels before the eighth one finally sold. The eighth was my debut. It took me 11 years. I worked with an agent that whole time. So I was very lucky that agents were interested in my work right from the beginning. And so that gave me a little bit of that like validation, like maybe I'm not just going to sit in the woods and write these books for me and nobody else. But it was tough. It was tough. And the best I can say in terms of dealing with rejection is that if you have that sense inside you that you're doing the right thing, it's our own inner voice that's going to get us through. Like maybe you don't have that agent and maybe nobody is picking up your work. But if you know that that's a story you've got to tell, look how many readers there are out there. Like it's going to speak to some of them. And who knows what road is going to get you there. In my case, what finally happened is I wrote to an author I really admired, and she read the manuscript that my agent had shopped and had not, my prior agent had shopped and had not gotten any offers on. She read it. She gave it to her own editor, this author, and that editor made an offer on my eighth novel. She was at a publisher that had rejected the same book 6 months before.
Oh,
So it can happen in so many different ways. Like get out there, meet other writers, go to conferences, whether virtually or live, make those connections, keep writing, and knock on every door, knock on things that aren't doors. I almost guarantee one of them will open if you just don't stop knocking.
hmm. Yeah, that's incredible. I've never heard, I interviewed a lot of authors. That's the most, what do you call that? Roundabout way.
Circuitous.
Yeah, I love it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, is that your eighth novel, which is your first novel? Is that the one that won the Mary Higgins Clark Award?
It is. So this book that won the Mary Higgins Clark, I'll brag on it a little. It was reviewed
Yeah.
in the just because it's like whatever, comeuppance. It was reviewed in the New York Times. It had some really cool stuff happen to it, rejected everywhere. Every publisher turned it down.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I was just watching a documentary because I love the TV show The Sopranos. I was just watching the
Yeah.
documentary, and same thing. David Chase, the creator, it was turned down by all the networks.
I did not know that.
Uh,
Well, there you go.
Yep. And so I also read that you do these cross country book tours. So I'm really curious about that, especially since everything's so virtual now. I love that. Can you tell us a little bit about that and some interesting experiences, perhaps? And can you tell us a little bit, like how long do they last and how does it work?
So how it worked, I mean, keep in mind, you're right. It's more virtual now. And honestly, the first time we went out was 2013, then 2014, then 2015. In 2016, 2017, my publisher sent me out. So even if you're looking at 2017, it's still 7 years. Like I do wonder what the 2024-25 equivalent will look like. And that's set to unfold. But I will talk about it a little because it's one of my happiest set of memories. And I do believe that there can be a translation for writers. You said there's lots of emerging writers listening. I think there's a translation and a message we can get from those experiences, even in this very modern era. So what happened was 11 years to get published, blah, 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 and met tons of people. And I wanted to get out there and I wanted to say hi to them. I wanted to thank them for their support along the way. So my husband and I rented out our house. We traded in 2 cars for an SUV that could get across the Rockies in February. We pulled our kids out of school. They were in first and third grades, and we car schooled them in the back seat. And we crisscrossed the country for 7 months, 115,000 miles.
Wow.
We went to bookstores and libraries and book clubs. And it was wonderful. I mean, people who are listening, go to my website, go to I forget which page it is, but there are 2 little music videos. They're short, they're sweet, and it shows just books across this country. It was one of the, best times, I would say, of my whole life. And now I don't know what that'll look like. Now I'm with Thomas and Mercer and we'll see. But for authors who are coming up, I can't overestimate the power of the face-to-face. You don't have to get out there for 7 months. You don't have to rent out your house. Like, find a bookstore, find a book club, find a library, draw a little radius around where you are and go out overnight. Make some stops with your book. Even before you're published, make some stops at these bookish, the bookish ecosystem and get to know people, because it paid dividends for me that are still happening today. I'm still hearing from people who are like, hey, I met you on the road in 2017. Would you like to come back I now have a podcast, or I now have a virtual book club. Would you like to come back? And when we make those face-to-face connections, I feel like it really enriches everybody's life.
Yeah, I think that's something that's changed so much in the past few decades of publishing. Is this the connection now with the readers is much more personal than it was 30 years ago, probably, maybe even 10, 15 years ago.
Right. You can have a relationship now. And so many of those people that I met along the way are my newsletter subscribers, and we email each other. Like, we're still in each other's lives. So, yeah.
Yeah. Have you ever thought about I know you're busy now with your books, but that would be a great memoir.
Everybody says, I know. I'm not a great nonfiction writer. I don't always do it. But yeah, I mean, life on the road work. I have thought about it.
Yeah, especially with the whole book angle too, because it's so
right.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, and so I was also going to want to ask you here on the nitty gritty of the actual writing process, because that's I was snoopy about that myself. But so, what's your process? Do you outline? Do you just start writing?
So I write in a little converted shed. It has electricity, but not much else. So it has heat for our long Catskill winters. I go out there and no outline, but I have a filing cabinet, which is an improvement. Up until recently, it was like a big box. I have a filing cabinet, and they're filled with envelopes that have little scraps of paper, little receipts, little whatever I could get my hands on wherever I happen to be, that I'm taking this note or that note. And I order them kind of linearly. And that is the novel in a filing cabinet. So it's like little bits of scenes, or like a line of dialogue, or maybe a metaphor that I'm going to weave in. And then I kind of just sit down and I let the story take me, because there's always a very big point of triumph in any of my books, like published and unpublished. They always are going to this point of you can exhale, and the character, whether it's whoever it is, a psychologist, as in my new series, or whoever it is, has done something that allows them to live their best life. And so I kind of let that tide carry me along in the story. And then when I know that there's a place that's sort of blank, I get up and I go over to my filing cabinet and I pull out the appropriate piece of paper, and then I mush it all together.
Oh, wow. It's interesting. That's a great process.
Yeah, I can't guarantee it would work for anybody else, but so far it's worked for me.
Yeah. Obviously, it's worked out very well. So yeah, was it if it's not broken, don't fix it?
Right, exactly. Yeah, I'm not going to mess with it.
And so, and so, what's the process then like? Because you say you're with Thomas and Mercer, and I really have been reading a lot of their thrillers. They I
Yeah.
really enjoy the thrillers that they put out. What's been the process with them? Is it has it been? Do you enjoy working with them? How's it been so far?
It's been a million times like anything I thought it was going to be, it's been a million times more. So, like, my first three novels came out from Random House, Ballantine, and then my next two from Source Books, which is an independent publisher. And that was a very cool experience. And then when I made the move to Thomas and Mercer, I was completely unprepared. I knew they were putting out great crime fiction. I had judged awards for international thriller writers for a couple of cycles, and I knew that many of the winning entries or the finalists were Thomas and Mercer. So I had a good feeling about their crime fiction. But then the publisher actually reached out to my agent and asked if we could meet. And from the moment we sat down together and she kind of had this creative spark, like, readers are really interested in psychology. Have you ever thought about incorporating your background? And then I began working with my editor, and then it's just been incredibly creative and inspiring. They really care about words over there. And my editor and I would go back and forth about like the word origin from the Latin about this or that sentence that I mean, so it's just been very literary, I think is what I would call it. It's been like the most literary experience I've had since I was in school studying it.
Wow, yeah, it's like a creative writing course,
Yeah,
master's degree crammed in there.
exactly. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. So it's been a thrill.
yeah. And that's something that's in the last few years. I mean, I know psychological thrillers, domestic thrillers have been around for forever, but like you said, Thomas and Mercer mentioned that, and I've noticed that too. And it's so popular now that genre. Why? I'm just kind of curious too. Why do you think it's become so popular in the last few years? Any insight on that with your background?
That's a great question. The author Carla Buckley and I did a panel together once, and I think the topic was something like domestic thrillers, high stakes on the small stage. I'll say it again, high stakes on the small stage, right? Because it's like it's your house, or it's your neighbor's house, or it's a psychotherapy office, and you're sitting one on one. And like, I think one of the reasons why they must be so popular is that they're our life writ a little larger. And it actually goes back to something you said just before about how, what if you could make it go a little more right? What if it could turn out a little bit better than it would in our messy, unarced, unplotted lives? And I think that's one of the reasons why domestic suspense and thrillers are so big, because it's something we all relate to and can recognize. And yet it's going to go maybe a little bit more the way we'd want it to if we ran the zoo and had all the control.
Yeah, I think that as a reader, that's something that I always think there's so much fun is because yeah, I can picture myself in that. I mean, I love my FBI thrillers and Michael Connelly and all that, but I'm
Yeah,
not an FBI agent, I'm not a detective. So it's kind of cool to see regular people
right.
like in your novel, your characters. It's like, oh, I can see myself, So it's you
Yeah.
more it gets us more involved in the stories, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's really interesting. And yeah, like you said, I mean, I love Reacher. I am never going to be 6'5" and 250 pounds. And it's great to put myself, after I read a Reacher novel, I always like have to be talked down a bit because I feel like I could kill a man with my bare hands. And no, I can't. But it's true. When I read some of the domestic thrillers and suspense that's out there now, I'm relating in a very different way.
Just you mentioned Reacher because I was checking out your website before I hit the record button,
Yeah.
and that's got to be the coolest blurb I've ever read. I got it right here. Milchman is the Swiss Army knife of thriller writers from the one and only Lee Child. I mean, how cool was that?
He's so smart. And I've been lucky enough to meet Lee a few times, and he's super smart and intelligent, and so is Reacher. I mean, you can see him in the character. And I did. I thought that was a very smart blurb. Like, I had to sit there and think about, what does he mean? Oh, that's kind of neat if I'm that. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I was able to interview him for on the podcast, and I was kind of blown away how he's so down to earth
Yes,
and
it's true.
that's yeah, like you said, very smart guy.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So, so can you give us a little? I know you just put the books out, and are you starting now to work on a third one, or what are you working on now?
I am working on like refilling the bank. So for all the emerging writers, I think it's super important to, at least for me, my process, to take like a breather between novels and let things fill up again. So when I'm in that mode, I'm sort of like living in the world and things are coming in, they're being filtered, but I don't know exactly what role they're going to play in which book. Because it's a series, I do have some, ideas for where I think Arles is going to go. And at the end of book 2, something very big happens to her that's going to change her destiny. And so in whatever book 3 becomes, that will have to be there. But I don't know much more than that. Like I'm letting it kind of gel.
You got to refill the filing cabinet with ideas.
Refill it. That's exactly right. I mean, yeah, it's literally drawn down. The envelopes are all flat right now.
All right. So one of the last questions I always ask my guests, and I know we've already touched on this a little bit, but any advice for a aspiring thriller, suspense writer that's listening to the podcast?
Yeah. I mean, there's so much you could say. I definitely recommend like join International Thriller Writers, which is actually free or very low dues if you're pre-published, because building those connections is one of the most important things I think can happen. If you're a mystery writer, or even really a lot of the genres have kind of blended. Sisters in Crime is a great organization, Mystery Writers of America. I'm a big believer in joining or writers organizations and then going to their conferences. And read, when we talked before about like sitting in the stacks and like what kind of books you're weaned on and stuff, that's how I finally came to the book that was going to break through. And as I said, like, you don't necessarily know which book is going to make it. You might keep writing and it might be your second. It could be, I hope it will not be your 8th. If you're listening to podcasts like this, it will not be your 8th because you're getting so much good advice. And I was very isolated as a writer, but make those connections, read those books, and don't stop. Just don't stop.
Yeah, that's good advice. I think that's a big one for writers is, you can't give up.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Like most of us, even if you weren't getting published or anything, probably still be writing just because we have to.
Yeah. I mean, there's other great advice that I don't even know who to attribute to, but like if you can not write, don't, because it's so punishing, but it's also just so fun, and if you're living in the fun part of it, the punishing part will go down a little easier. And it does end. You'll get to the other side.
Yeah, great. Awesome advice. And so where can the listeners find you? Your website's probably the best place to find you.
Definitely go, to jennymilchman.com. And I have a newsletter that's really like a community of writers and readers, and I'd love people to join us there.
Yeah, and I checked out your website. You got some cool stuff on there, the book tour, and some teaching stuff. So you do a lot of talking. Do you enjoy that, talking to writers? And
I love teaching. I've done a few like workshops that I sort of, morph depending on the audience. So like sometimes for kids, sometimes for adults. And there are a few topics that I particularly love teaching about. But yeah, I think teaching writers is one of the most energizing things another writer can do.
Now that I know I'm kind of backtracking, but I just glanced at your book cover, and I was going to mention this earlier. It is so cool. It's like really stands out. The Usual Silence. Were you like, that must have been exciting when you first saw that?
Oh my gosh. When that box of books came, I've talked about this elsewhere. It was like opening a treasure chest. They look like rubies, like they glow. And I can say it because I had nothing to do with it. Like they are just so talented over there. And yeah.
Awesome. Well, The Usual Silence is coming out October 1st. It's available now. If you're listening to this before the 1st, you can go to Amazon and order it now. I highly recommend it. Jenny, thank you so much. It was very nice talking to you.
Thank you. I had a great time. I really appreciate it.
That wraps up this episode of Meet the Thriller Author. A big thank you to Jenny Milchman for joining us today and giving us a fascinating look into her latest novel, The Usual Silence. Don't forget, it's set to be released on October 1st and is already topping the Amazon charts, so make sure to grab your copy. If you enjoyed today's episode, I'd love it if you could take a moment to leave a review or share the podcast with your fellow thriller lovers. And if you're interested in my own work, my psychological thriller, The Basement, is out now and climbing the charts in the domestic thriller category over at Amazon. You can find it at thrillingreads.com/basement. As always, you can visit thrillerauthors.com for show notes, archives, and transcripts of this and all other interviews. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next episode.